Tonight, we're breaking down the escalating Iran war, the congressional fight over presidential powers, Trump's rejection of the Supreme Court's mail-in voting decision, along with the 2026 midterm elections, Russia-Iran sanctions, Federal Reserve maintaining independence on interest rates, and Trump's new tariff framework. Sounds like a lot, but this is not just a list of political headlines. Underneath all 5 stories is a deeper pattern. Is Trump moving faster than accountability can keep up with him? And when that happens, ordinary people usually feel the consequences first. All right, let's get into it. What's going on, everybody? I'm D'Anthony Collins, and this is The Quiet Loud, where we don't just talk about the news, we connect the dots and expose the pattern. So let's begin with the biggest and most dangerous story of the week. The war with Iran has escalated again. Iran launched multiple ballistic missiles toward U.S. forces in the Middle East. CENTCOM says every single missile was intercepted, but past reporting would lead us to question CENTCOM, but that's a different story. I'll leave that for now. In response, though, U.S. and Saudi forces struck Iran-backed militia sites in Iraq. The militia group says at least 20 fighters were killed and 32 wounded. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed, and Iran has rejected an Omani proposal for managing traffic through that waterway. Now, oil markets, including Brent crude, rose approximately $85 per barrel after the latest escalation as our National Reserve nears tank bottom. The question now is whether limited retaliation becomes a wider regional war, because Congress is still fighting over whether the president can continue military action without any formal authorization. The House passed another resolution seeking to halt U.S. military action in Iran, and the vote there was 214 to 208. The Senate considered a similar resolution but rejected it 47 to 49. Now, the House resolution doesn't instantly shut the war down, and the Senate vote doesn't instantly mean Congress endorses Trump's every military action, but these votes reveal the central constitutional problem. Does Trump have the authority to keep conducting this war without Congress formally authorizing it? That's the key issue here. Not whether Iran is dangerous or has attacked American forces, we know they have. Not whether or not Trump believes military escalation is necessary. The issue here is who gets to make the decision and how long that decision can continue. Because the administration argues that Trump has the constitutional authority to defend the United States and American citizens from threats posed by Iran. That's true. Enemies, foreign and domestic. But critics in Congress say the war has no clear mission, no clearly defined strategy, and no obvious endpoint. A president can believe military action is necessary, but that doesn't give him or her unlimited authority. A threat can be real, and the process can still be wrong. A war can be justified in theory and still be conducted without a clear mission, a real strategy, or a clear plan for success and withdrawal. The cost of that lack of preparedness shows up in military families anxiously waiting for a phone call. It shows up in energy markets and in our federal budget. It shows up in the possibility of a larger regional war. And eventually, it shows up in our household expenses. Here's the part that a lot of people don't know. A war doesn't have to reach American soil to affect our American life. The conflict can still reach your kitchen table, our fuel costs, our airfare, our utility bills. Now, let me be clear about something. This is not an argument that every military threat should be ignored. It is an argument that the public deserves to know the mission goals and the exit strategy. We also need to be confident that we're not out committing war crimes or hiding the number of our soldiers who've been wounded or worse. The Constitution divides war powers because concentrated power is dangerous, especially during a crisis. That's yet another reason we don't have kings. But when Congress is afraid to challenge Trump and he treats their objections as symbolic or toothless, the separation of powers begins to weaken right before our eyes. Now let's move from the battlefield to the ballot box, because the second major story this week is about an executive order that could change how mail-in voting works before the November midterm elections. The Trump administration has asked the Supreme Court to intervene in a legal challenge brought by 23 states and Washington, D.C. All right? At the center of the case is an executive order targeting mail-in voting. The order would create a federal citizenship list system and direct the Postal Service to deliver ballots only to people appearing on those lists. The administration presents this as an election integrity policy. But the states challenging the order say the president is just trying to take power that belongs to Congress and the states. And the legal picture has become even more complicated because the First Circuit declined to lift the lower court block, but a separate D.C. Circuit ruling has allowed the administration's challenge to continue on the argument that it may be too early for courts to intervene. Now, 12 Republican-led states, led by Alabama, have also joined the administration's request for the Supreme Court to pause the lower court order. The justices have not issued a final ruling, and those responses are due on August 3rd. So that means the immediate issue is that the conflicting court rulings have created uncertainty over which rules should prepare to be followed before the midterms. So look, everybody understands the appeal of the phrase election integrity. Of course, our elections should be secure. Voter eligibility should be protected, and the fraudulent ballots should not be counted. But the legal confusion that Trump has created is who has the authority to create the rules. The lower court blocked key parts of that executive order. The states argue that they have already spent money preparing for the midterms under rules that are currently in effect. But one court noted that Massachusetts had already spent millions of dollars on ballot envelopes that could become unusable if federal requirements change. That matters because election administration involves physical materials. It involves envelopes and printing contracts, software and training, coordination with postal systems, and thousands of other local workers, all with their own deadlines. Change the rules late in that process, and the cost is not just political confusion. It can create practical confusion, and a voter may follow every rule and still wonder whether their ballot will be accepted. The government may pursue election security. They should. But Trump cannot simply say this is important and automatically gain every power related to that single issue. That is what institutional limits are for. Because if election procedures can be changed by executive order, then the rules of voting can become dependent on whoever controls the White House at the time. One administration creates a national voter list. Another changes the mail-in requirements. Another changes the deadlines. And voters are expected to just keep up with all of it. Election control does not always arrive literally by saying you cannot vote. Sometimes it arrives through a new voter list or some new federal guideline, with the final result not visible until somebody's ballot is rejected, delayed, or not even delivered. If you're getting value from this kind of breakdown, take a second and like the video and subscribe to The Quiet Loud. We're here to understand the pattern beneath the headlines, and this week, that pattern is becoming even harder to ignore. The third story takes us back overseas, but this time the pressure is moving through Congress and the global economy. The Senate advanced a bipartisan sanctions bill targeting Russia and Iran by a vote of 86-12. Now, that's a significant bipartisan vote. We don't see votes like that all the time, especially these days. Now, the House would still need to consider it, and the legislation could change before anything ever reaches the White House. But an 86-12 vote tells us that there is serious support in the Senate for increasing economic pressure on Iran and Russia. The bill targets Russian officials, oligarchs, financial institutions, and what is commonly referred to as Russia's shadow fleet, these ships that move oil while avoiding the sanctions. It also extends sanctions against Iran's financial and weapons industries, but the most consequential part of it may be the tariff authority. The bill would give the president authority to impose tariffs on up to 100% of the world's largest purchasers of Russian oil and gas, with China and India among the countries most directly implicated. That is a much bigger tool than just a narrow sanction. It would allow the administration to use tariffs against countries that continue buying Russian energy while also extending sanctions against Russia and Iran. Now, again, this bill has yet to be passed in the House. Now, some lawmakers support the measure because they believe that Russia's energy revenue is helping finance his war against Ukraine. Now, that concern is legitimate. Countries should not be able to wage war while operating as if the global economy has no consequences. All right. But there's a bigger question that I think we have to ask. Does punishing a foreign government require handing Trump yet another enormous economic weapon? Because we've seen how Trump uses what he believes is his tariff authority. If tariffs are imposed, importers often pass much of that cost down the chain. By the time that policy reaches us, it may not look like some kind of foreign policy decision. It may look like just a higher price on food or fuel, electronics, car parts, household goods. This is why the Senate vote matters beyond the Senate. The United States is trying to use economic power to influence multiple conflicts at once. It can create leverage, yes, but that leverage comes at a cost. All right. Now let's bring this home, because the fourth story is about the Federal Reserve and whether the independent institution can operate under political pressure. Now we have the Federal Reserve's decision. Okay. The Fed had held its benchmark interest rate steady in a range of 3.5 to 3.75%. But the vote was sharply divided, but not the way you would think. 9 lawmakers voted to hold the rate steady, while 3 preferred a quarter-point increase. The Fed specifically cited energy-related supply shocks as one reason inflation remained above its 2% target. Now, Fed Chair Kevin Warsh left the door open for future rate increases if inflation remains elevated. So Trump's political pressure, like he imposed on Jerome Powell for lower interest rates, did not produce a cut. Well, not so far. But the decision also shows that the Fed is not comfortable with the inflation picture. The question is not simply whether borrowing gets cheaper. Is whether the Fed believes the economy is being hit by temporary shocks or entering another period of persistent price increases. All right. So the Fed's job is not to make Trump happy. The Fed's job is to manage monetary policy, control inflation as much as possible, and support a stable labor market. All right. These goals are already difficult, but they become even more difficult when energy prices are rising because of this war, when tariffs are increasing import prices, and the president is publicly demanding lower rates all the time. Lower rates can make borrowing cheaper. Yes, they can help people buy homes and finance cars, expand their businesses, or manage their debt. But if inflation is too high, cutting those rates too aggressively can make the problem even worse. The Fed has to answer a question households understand very well. How do you make money less expensive to borrow without making everything else more expensive to buy? If you're trying to buy a house, then you care about mortgage rates. If you have credit card debt, then you care about interest rates. If you run a business, then you care about financing costs. And if you're renting, you may feel the effects of housing demand and construction costs. And people with the fewest financial options usually feel the instability first. And now we arrive at the story that connects almost everything we've discussed so far tonight. The administration has imposed new tariffs on 60 trading partners under a forced labor justification, okay? Yeah, the tariffs that have already been knocked down. Now, these duties are either 10% or 12.5%, depending on the country. The policy covers the top 60 U.S. trading partners, representing approximately 99.4% of the U.S. imports. But there are product exemptions, and goods already covered by Section 232 tariffs are excluded. The official policy says that countries that have committed to adopting forced labor import bans face the 10% tariff. Now, countries that have not made the commitment face the 12.5% tariff. The policy came after the Supreme Court, like I said before, rejected the administration's previous emergency powers tariff framework. So all they did was go back and change the legal pathway. The old framework was challenged, as will be this new framework, which uses Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 and argues that trading partners are not doing enough to prevent goods with forced labor from entering global commerce. Now, preventing forced labor is a legitimate policy goal. Nobody is for sweatshops, okay? But several trade partners and outside analysts have questioned whether the investigation is really about labor standards at all, or whether it's being used to recreate a broad tariff system under a new legal authority, all right? The administration says the new tariffs are legally durable, but critics say that the policy is an attempt to just revive the same tariffs that the court have already rejected. Either way, we already know that a tariff is collected by an importer, and then they move through the supply chains, and then they reach us through clothing and food, electronics and machinery, vehicle parts and other products. And when the policy covers almost the entire import system, 99.4%, the consequences are too difficult to isolate. This is where the politics becomes personal. The government can describe a tariff as a national security measure, a trade measure, or a forced labor measure, but the customer pays the final price, and it's often paid in the form of back-to-school supplies or filling up before a morning commute. We all understand what this policy changes in our lives. It may be the clearest example this week of institutions bending around executive power. The Supreme Court rejects one tariff pathway, and the policy returns with another. Congress debates whether to give Trump even more tariff authority, while the White House argues that the new policy is different. All the while, ordinary people like us are left asking whether the distinction will change what we pay. It won't. So let's connect these 5 stories. Iran has resumed missile attacks in the U.S., and Saudi Arabia have responded with strikes in Iraq. The mail voting fight now includes conflicting appellate rulings and competing state requests before the Supreme Court. The sanctions bill has advanced with possibility of up to 100% tariffs on major buyers of Russian oil. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve has held rates steady despite political pressure from Trump, while 3 governors actually argued inflation requires needed a hike. And the administration's new tariff system covers nearly the entire import economy under a different legal framework. Now, it seems like 5 different stories, but there is one pattern, and that pattern is that the checks are not disappearing quietly. They all seem to now be colliding before our eyes. The normal process is supposed to slow things down. Okay, it's checks and balances, but that process only works if each institution is willing to use its authority. If Congress refuses to challenge Trump, then the executive branch grows stronger. If courts block an action, but the administration can recreate it simply through another statute, then the practical effects of that will continue. And if election rules change faster than local governments can prepare, voter confusion will lead to lower turnout. Okay? If war expands before the public understands the mission, military families will absorb that danger. Now, let me be clear about something. Congress can be slow, and courts do disagree. All right? Federal agencies make mistakes all the time, and presidents, in fact, face real emergencies. Okay? Emergencies sometimes we don't even know about, but the institutional friction that we see is not always dysfunction. The danger comes when that friction is treated as an inconvenience instead of a safeguard. This week's pattern is about power without enough of that friction. So hit me up in the comments section. I always respond, all right? Tell me which of these stories you think will have the biggest effect on ordinary people over the next few months. Please like the video, subscribe, and join the Quiet Quorum. And as always, stay grounded, stay informed, and stay loud quietly. This is the Quiet Loud. Y'all take care.